Good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Kilbride, and my title is the Chief Executive of Adhd Ireland. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the COCO project, the Whelan Lab here in Trinity, and ourselves. And I say we're all delighted that you could come, and if anybody's watching us on the webcast, hello. First, the housekeeping. In the event that we have to leave the building in a hurry, there's emergency exits to my left here, and up the top, left and right. Always wanted to do that. As with any event, if you haven't turned your mobile phone off, we'd appreciate if you could do so now, or at least turn it to silent. We do hope you'll have a pleasurable and hopefully an informative evening. In looking at the last census figures in Ireland, we know that approximately 170,000 adults in Ireland have ADHD, and we base that on a 5% prevalence rate. One of the things we don't know is the rate of diagnosis among that 170,000. We can estimate that it's quite low. So we can see from ourselves that there probably is an issue of undiagnosed ADHD in adults. And from ourselves as a small charity who works in the area of ADHD, we know this to be a fact. And the reason why I can say that is, in terms of the support line that we have, 25% of all our calls are from adults looking to get information on how to get a diagnosis. So we're getting several hundred calls a year, moving up to the figure of about 1,000. So we know there's a crying issue out there for people to find out how to do it. One of the subsets of the calls we get is, my child has just been diagnosed with ADHD. I have the same symptoms as my child. Where do I get a diagnosis? To help us look at that, we brought in three experts, and we're very thankful again, and I'd like to thank Cora particularly for organising and help us organise this, the COCO project from the EU. So first we have up is Dr. Joseph Antonio Ramones, and Tony is a doctor in psychiatry and clinical psychology from the University of Autonomo in Barcelona, and he's an accepted European leader on ADHD in teenagers and adults. And to set the scene, Tony will present us with an update on the assessment of adults, an assessment on treatment of ADHD in adults. It's my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome to the stage Dr. Tony Ramos.
Thank you, Ken, for the presentation. And thank you to the organization for the ADHD Ireland for organizing this event, this symposium during our COCA meeting in Dublin. To me, it's a great pleasure to be here and to share with all of you aspects around the assessment, at the end, the diagnosis and the treatment of adults with ADHD. I am a psychiatrist by training. I am the head of the Department of Psychiatry in the Hospital Universitari Vall d'Hebron in Barcelona, and also professor at the University Autonomous of Barcelona. And we are working for the last, I think, 20 years around this perspective of adult ADHD and ADHD across lifespan. Today my talk will be around these two aspects, diagnosis and treatment of ADHD during the adulthood. This is my financial disclosures, relationships with several companies and technological companies, and also grants of national and international agencies. This is the outline that I would to present today. We will have a little introduction about the topic, and later on we will move to the assessment of adult ADHD and what instruments we have at the moment and what instruments there are available on the international setting, and treatment of adult ADHD will be the last aspect. I will focus my presentation on drug treatment, but it's not the only treatment that is necessary and available for adults with ADHD. And finally, a little conclusions about all of this talk. As you know, I think very well, ADHD is a disorder that typically started in childhood, and that is very important for the adult ADHD diagnosis, because if we pay attention to this characteristic started the disorder during childhood, we will increase our specificity with this disorder, and we could manage better with the comorbidities that are typical in adulthood. And I would like to stress that ADHD is not only a male disorder. Probably, as you know, female are the patients with ADHD with higher level of problems across lifespan, in terms, for example, with higher level of mortality. Why? Because a decrease of the treatment during childhood. If you arrive to the adulthood without correct treatment during childhood, that increase the risk for car accidents, substance use disorder, and other problems. For that, it's essential to start treatment, holistic treatment during the childhood. And the main part of these children will continue with some kind of type of symptoms during adulthood. And for that, it's necessary to have a continuous treatment during this adulthood. ADHD is not a new disorder. We know very well that the first descriptions of patients with inattentive syndrome or hyperactivity was during the 18th century by Adam Baker, a German doctor. But also, the last century, we have fantastic descriptions of ADHD in my language. My language is Catalan, but also the co-official language is Spanish. In Spanish, we have a very nice description of ADHD. Augusto Vidal Pereira described it in the beginning of the last century, that children with ADHD are like the butterflies, because don't pay attention to any of these stimulus. Yeah? And it's also important to highlight the first drug available for any psychiatric disorder, prior and first of all than schizophrenia, bipolar, or depression. The first drug was available for ADHD and was discovered in 1937 by Charles Bradley. That means that we have a long history on the ADHD drugs. And it's funny because we are talking about ADHD in some places or in some countries like a novelty. But the first studies with adults with ADHD was on the 67 and was report about children that continues assessment and follow-up until adulthood. And now we have in this year, in 2018, a fantastic moment because we have more and more and more findings, research on genetics, neuroimaging, new treatments for ADHD, and not only for adults. And that is this year will be a very interesting year in terms to understand better what means ADHD and what is the repercussions of ADHD for these new clinical trials and new papers. Okay, symptoms of ADHD are very known. We have the core symptoms of inattention, in hyperactivity disorders, but also in adolescence, but mainly in adulthood, it's very important, these emotional ability symptoms. And in some aspects could be more related with the dysfunction problems, these emotional ability symptoms, than the inattentive or hyperactivity symptoms. The other symptoms very common also during the adolescence is the motivational deficit syndrome. These symptoms are very typically related with the dopaminergic dysfunction. People know that it's necessary to do something, but it's like a rock on the legs that the patient can do these activities. This is all the profiles of very common symptoms during adulthood: inattentive, hyperactivity symptoms, and also emotional and motivational deficit. If we pay attention to the DSM-5 criteria, there are the most common criteria that we use for the diagnosis in psychiatry, the American Psychiatric Association criteria. Probably we are focused mainly on the 8 criteria about symptoms, inattentive symptoms, more than 5 symptoms on adulthood is necessary to have the criteria of ADHD, 6 of 9 in childhood. But also it's very important to pay attention to these B, C, and D criteria, because that is the essential characteristic of a disorder. ADHD is a disorder if ADHD have problems, dysfunction on the day by day, on work, at the school, at family, and it's not an only syndrome or disorder related with one setting. It's necessary more than 2 settings, at the school, at work, at home, and that is essential for the diagnosis, because if we don't have this criteria, we have a subsyndrome, not a disorder, yes? And probably with not necessary to treat or to start any drug treatment or psychological treatment. For that is essential to have a good assessment of all these dysfunctions. Probably that is the most important slide for the assessment. We have, later on we will explain some semi-structured interview scales that could be useful for the assessment of adult ADHD, but the most important is the clinical interview in an open way. It's necessary to know that ADHD is a chronic disorder. It's not an episodic disorder like a bipolar or in some cases personality disorders. And started during childhood, because that is a big difference respect this other disorder, because typically could start during the adulthood, for example, major depression or bipolar disorder. Obviously, these disorders can also start during childhood, but not with the typical age of ADHD in general. The other is to have the symptoms. If we don't have inattentive symptoms, we don't have hyperactivity symptoms, we don't have an ADHD patient. It's necessary to find clearly these symptoms and to search, to assess all the dysfunctions at work, at home, etc. Because these dysfunctions is the characteristic of the D disorder. With these dysfunctions, we don't have ADHD. There are several semi-structured interviews, self-report scales, or observer scales, and also neuropsychological tests that we can use to have a good assessment of the symptoms of ADHD, and why not to increase the quality of our assessment. Probably, if with a professional, with a good experience with adult ADHD, it's not necessary more than 15 minutes, because it's very typical, the symptoms, the follow-up, the history of the symptoms, yes? And you have an assessment of 30 years, 25 years of the life of the patient to perceive and to observe the symptoms. But if you want to have a good quality assessment, as minimum is necessary around 1 hour. And that is time costly, I know, but it's the quality of the assessment. In terms of interviews, we have several interviews. One of the first was the Conners interviews, the KDID. The KDID is a semi-structured interview, assess very well symptoms during childhood, symptoms during adulthood, the dysfunctions in the settings, etc. The problem with KDID is validated for adults, obviously for adults with ADHD, but the problem is that it's necessary to pay fees, and it's costly in this sense. The other is the DIVA, Adult ADHD Interview 2.0. DIVA is a very well-known interview at the moment. It's available in a lot of languages. It's free. You can access to this interview as clinician if you have access to the website on the European Network of Adult ADHD that is led by Sandra Coy. We developed this interview and we validate in several languages. And also it's an application available for iOS and Android, and could be useful on the clinical setting if you are using tables, tablets for to do the clinical interviews. Yes. It's free in paper with the PDF if you don't log with the website, but the application is necessary to pay some fees. And this is the paper of the validation of DIVA against to decade it with good psychometric properties. Another very good semi-structured interview that we validate in our center in Barcelona is the PRIST. It's the Psychiatric Research Interview for Substance and Mental Disorders. That is very important for ADHD in adulthood because 40% of the patients across lifespan, patients with ADHD across lifespan, will have some addiction in one moment, yes? Abuse or dependence, or cannabis, alcohol, cocaine, etc. And that is important to have instruments to assess this ADHD in conjunction or with comorbid substance use disorder, because some symptoms could be related with the substance use and not instead a clear ADHD. And it's important to have an interview that can differentiate symptoms secondary to use of drugs or ADHD symptoms itself. This interview has good psychometric properties, and that you can see here on the slide, with a good positive predictive value and also negative predictive value. Another very important aspect is the functionality. There are several tests to assess what is the impact and in what settings the patient have impact. This is very useful for clinical settings in the day-by-day because it's necessary only 5-10 minutes to assess all the symptoms. It's available, obviously, in English, and it's the functioning assessment short test. It's validated also for bipolars, for schizophrenia disorders, and also for adults with ADHD. This is the paper that we validate this semi-structured interview for the assessment of functionality. Here you can see the results of our validation when we compare adult patients with ADHD versus controls in all of the settings: cognitive functioning, autonomy, occupational functioning, interrelation setting, financial issues. Adult ADHD patient has more impact, more dysfunctions. The only item without difference between ADHD and controls was the leisure time. Fortunately, patients with ADHD can enjoy of this leisure time as the same that control patients. Another part, this previous part, is for to have a good diagnosis. DIVA instrument is the instrument that I recommend you for adult ADHD. If the patient has substance use disorder, you can use the PRINCE interview. This interview is time consuming because it's necessary at minimum 1 hour. And the other aspect is to assess the severity, the quantity of symptoms of ADHD. We have several scales. One is the Wender-Utah rating scale. This scale is a very well validated scale, and it's very useful for assess during the adulthood in the retrospective way what were the symptoms of ADHD during the childhood of this adult patient. And you can have a good assessment of these symptoms during the childhood of this adult patient. It's the Wender-Utah rating scale. The other is the ADHD rating scale. It's one of the most well-known rating scales for the assessment of adult ADHD symptoms. Both scales are free without any cost. The other is the ADHD self-report scale, the SSRS. This scale is a screening scale. It is a version of only 6 items, and is very useful for a quick screening or for epidemiological studies, and with good validations in several languages. It's without any cost because it's a scale promoted by the World Health Organization. And The other scale is the CARS, the Corners Adult ADHD Rating Scales. There are several versions, a long version with 66 items, I think, and a short version with 24 items. It's a good scale to assess all the symptoms, the clinical profile of adults with ADHD, but the problem is that it's necessary to pay fees and is costly in this sense. And finally, the other is the WARS, is the Wender-Rimley Adult ADHD Disorder Rating Scales. It's very similar in this sense with the Corners Adult ADHD Rating Scales. These are these typical scales that we use during clinical trials to assess the efficacy or not of any drug treatment or psychological treatment. This is the validation of the ARS scale also for people with ADHD plus substance use disorder. ICASA is another international collaboration that we promote the research on ADHD and substance use disorder. And one of the topics is to try to decrease the impact of substance use disorder in ADHD patients. This is the SSRS. It's very simple, only 6 items. If you have 4 or more X on this area, probably the patient will have an ADHD. And the psychometric properties with people with substance use disorder has good sensitivity, but the specificity decreased because the impact of substance use disorder with the symptoms of ADHD. And it's necessary, you have a positive result, to continue the assessment, because in some patients there is a false positive with this scale if the patient have also a substance use disorder. For the assessment of ADHD, cross lifespan is very important, this life transitional model. In each period of time, it's necessary to have a specific question, a specific assessment, and to pay attention to a specific impact on the life of the patient, and also the profile of professionals involved on the treatment of adults. It's different on the same profile of professionals during the childhood. And that also is a very typical situation. During childhood, patient has a lot of resources around the patient, the family, the teachers of the school, but curiously could decrease symptoms of ADHD over the time. And with fewer symptoms, probably patients have more functional impact. Why? Because decrease these supports around the patient. Another very important aspect that people from the Karolinska Institute studied this year is it's very common when patient has 18 years old, 19 years old, and arrive to the office of the adult psychiatry. Adult psychiatrists say, oh, I only can talk with the patient, not with the family, because it's the confidential situation. And that is a huge problem, because main part of the patient don't have a good idea of the impact of ADHD itself. This paper shown clearly that it's important to talk also with parents, because parents know better what is the situation of the patient. They correlated what is the response of the scales that made the patient and response of a scale that made the parents, and they crossed this data with all the register about car accidents, drug use, and the better informant on all the topic was the parents. But in terms of substance use disorder and risk of suicide, in these 2 aspects, the best informant report was the patient. Yeah? And it's important to combine information for the parents and also information for the patient. Okay, now we have a quick review about all the assessment about treatment. As I said before, treatment for ADHD is not a new treatment. It's the beginning of psychopharmacology in this sense. In 1937, with Charles Bradley, was discovered the first amphetamine used for ADHD. The problem is that at the moment important part of the patients continues, as you can see in this graph, continues with the symptoms of ADHD. But when arrived adulthood, decreased dramatically the number of patients under drug treatment. And that is a huge problem because drug treatment is correlated with a positive results and with positive functioning. For example, pay attention to this very essential paper, the correlation between to be on drug treatment and the level of criminality. This is a very important paper published in 2012 in New England Journal of Medicine, made by the group of Karolinska Institute, Henry Larsson, and they found a very important results. During the period of treatment, with not 100, 200,000 of patients, register-based study, they found clearly that during the period of time with drug treatment, a decrease of criminality around 42-42%. And that is important for the patients and also for the society. But it's not only criminality the good result. If you assess car accidents during the period of time with drug treatment, it's a clear decrease of car accidents, a clear decrease also of suicidality, a clear decrease also of depressive symptoms or substance use disorder. For that, it's very important if the patient has symptoms, please continue the treatment. For how long time? What is necessary? If patients continue with symptoms, it's necessary to continue the treatment in order to decrease these adverse events of ADHD. And the good message is that it's possible to manage this bad consequence. We have several treatments, as you know, stimulants, non-stimulants, and drugs with non-licenses for ADHD. I will make a quick review about what is the evidence for adults with ADHD. Now, in terms of the best knowledge, we have the best knowledge for drugs treatment for ADHD. Also in adulthood, we have good clinical trials, we have meta-analysis, analysis of these clinical trials, also for adults, the highest levels of evidence. Now is one of these, the last meta-analysis we review in our center, where is the efficacy of methylphenidate for adults with ADHD. And we found clearly the same level of efficacy similar than in children. And very important, if we increase the doses, like 1 milligram per kilo, is a highest effect size, around 0.8, 0.7. That is for methylphenidate. For amphetamines, we published in the same year on the Cochrane collaboration meta-analysis about the efficacy of amphetamines. Amphetamines are different to methylphenidate. The mechanism of action between methylphenidate and amphetamines are similar but are different also. And we found the highest effect size for a drug treatment with amphetamines, around 0.7, 0.8. Now we have a new amphetamine, LDX, amphetamine. It's an interesting drug because it's a prodrug with the longest period of action, around 13 hours. That is important because it's a prodrug that reduces the risk of misuse, and that is important for adults with ADHD and adolescents also. Regarding non-stimulant drugs, we have atomoxetine. Atomoxetine has a moderate effect size, 0.5, 0.4, for adults with ADHD. It's important to pay attention that if you maintain during a long period of time the treatment, that could increase the efficacy of atomoxetine. It's a drug that is necessary more time on treatment to increase the efficacy of the drug. That is the example on this graph. If you continue the treatment over 12 weeks, they increase also the efficacy of the atomoxetine. Regarding the guidelines, we have several guidelines, and in this year appeared a review of, will be a new review of NICE guideline. The first line treatment for adults is pharmacological treatment. They recommended that, and 10 years ago they recommended methylphenidate. Now the new recommendation that will be appeared will be methylphenidate or lisdexamfetamine, LDX, and in non-response to use atomoxetine in this case. The other guidance that we have is the European consensus of the European Network for ADHD. That appeared years ago, and now will appear this year a review of this European consensus. Our first recommendation is to introduce psychoeducation for ADHD patients, mainly for ADHD patients that was the disorder diagnosis in the first time during adulthood. Yeah? And the first line treatment, we recommended 8 years ago stimulants, and our recommendation now will be the same, stimulants, methylphenidate, or in this case, lisdexamfetamine, and on the second line, atomoxetine. There are more drugs that have good clinical trials for adults with ADHD, but without indication, yes, like bupropion, or in this case also guanfacine. Very important, before to start the treatment, to good assessment on mainly arterial tension. It's important, yes, but it's not necessary. ECG, EEG is not necessary. It's necessary to do a good clinical assessment. And we have several contraindications. It's necessary to assess carefully. For example, if a patient has epilepsy, we could treat with ADHD drug, but it's necessary to monitorize. Or if we have any cardiovascular disorder, it's necessary to control hypertension or to control the cardiovascular disorder. And after that, we could treat the ADHD also. And that is a recommendation of the Canadian guideline. It's necessary to personalize the treatment. I presented general recommendations, first-line treatment, second-line treatment, but each patient is a different patient, and we need to personalize this treatment around these characteristics. Also, if we have patients with ADHD plus cocaine dependence, we can treat. And in this paper, published 3 years ago, the group of Francis Levin in New York demonstrate clearly that it's possible to control ADHD symptoms, to decrease symptoms with amphetamines, and also decrease the use of cocaine. And that is important. This myth that if you have drug-dependent substance use disorder, it's forbidden to use a stimulant is not a realistic approach. Finally, very brief, cognitive behavioral therapy is the psychological treatment with highest levels of evidences for adults with ADHD. This is the model of suffering that we are using in our clinic, and there are several clinical trials with this perspective with good results. The problem is to have the resource to do this and to have enough psychologists in your team for do the cognitive behavioral therapy. The other very promising therapy with some clinical trials is mindfulness. In this sense, there are meta-analysis, and mindfulness has effect size around 0.5 for inattentive symptoms and also hyperactivity. In our center, we are using virtual reality for applying mindfulness. And that is very useful for us because patients are doing therapy at home. We rent the virtual reality glasses, and every day young patients are doing this mindfulness applied by virtual reality. And with this modality, we can increase the adherence to the treatment and to have enough resource to introduce patients with another psychological therapy. We are doing this a clinical trial with this new approach, and with the collaboration of this company. Scius is a company of virtual reality treatments for psychiatric disorders. Okay, I think we are on time. Finally, a little conclusions. Absolutely essential, a comprehensive clinical assessment for adults with ADHD. Sure. We have several semi-structured interviews that we can increase our reliability of this assessment, and also we have scales for the assessment of severity and functionality of ADHD. The other is, to me, is very important, this message. We are using drugs with more than 70 years old, are not new drugs. We know perfectly all the bad and the good of these drugs. The other, this is very important. This drug not only decrease symptoms of ADHD, impact on the functionality, on the day-by-day of the patient with car accidents, criminality, etc. We have good clinical trials and meta-analysis, good evidences, and also good clinical guidelines to assess and to treat ADHD during the adulthood. Finally, thank you for your attention, and thank you to all my colleagues from Barcelona and all the family of the COCA European Consortium. Thank you so much for your attention.
I've been working in the ADHD arena for just over a year now, and I'd have to say that's the most comprehensive 30 minutes I've ever seen on an introduction to assessment and treatment of ADHD.
But in Spanglish.
But in Spanglish. It also was very comprehensive, and there was a lot of information in there. So just to let you know, this talk is being recorded. Wilson over there is looking after that. So we will be making it available. So if you didn't get it all, we will be getting back, you can get back to us. But probably most important, while you did get all the information via the presentation, we'd like to open to questions. So if you have any questions now, could you put your hand up? What we do is we have a couple of microphones, we'll go around, because obviously just a big room, lots of people, and if we want to hear it, you probably just need to use the microphone. So does anybody have any questions for Tony, not for me? Just up the back, Jack. I'll wait for the microphone, Jack.
Right. Oh, okay.
I was wondering about misinformation out there and how that affects treatment for people, because I know a lot of people go off medication, and a lot of people just fail to believe in their own diagnosis. Like, has that had an effect so far in treatment? Have you seen that?
Okay. Thank you for the question. It's important. I think it's necessary to do a good psychoeducation for the patients and to explain why it is necessary to use the drugs and the drug treatment. To me, I understand that it's not fashion or not absolutely sexy to talk about the mechanism of action of drugs and the neuroreceptors on the brain. It's more sexy if you want to talk about psychological treatment, but the reality is that we have a good message. We have treatment for this disorder. If we are dealing with, this rare disease, no? There are a lot of rare diseases without any treatment, without any possibility to impact on the life of the patient and the family. And to me, it's important, this message. Yeah, sure.
Harry, thanks very much. How do you know it's working? Because I'm conservative now for probably 20 years, and I still suffer with depression. I still have difficulties around the nose at times. And last November, I threatened with suicide. So, what do we do to try and
Okay, that is an important question, because not all the patients have the same response to the treatment. We know that around 30% of the patients don't respond well to methylphenidate or to amphetamines. And in a case like that, it's necessary to pay attention. What is the doses that you are using? Yes, I don't know, but the best doses in terms of efficacy is around 1 milligram per kilo. If you don't have a good response, sure, the best drugs at the moment in terms of efficacy in general, yes, are amphetamines. I will try to explain very quick what is the difference between methylphenidate and amphetamines. Methylphenidate is an inhibitor of the reuptake of dopamine on the presynaptic cleft. Yeah, it's the same like amphetamines, but amphetamines deliver more dopamine on the cleft. In general, there are 4 different mechanisms of actions of amphetamines and 2 mechanisms of actions for methylphenidate, and that is the explanation why amphetamines has a better or have a better efficacy in this sense. And if a patient has depression also, in some cases it's necessary to use together with ADHD treatment an antidepressant for that. Yeah? Each patient is necessary to assess the response, and the scales are very useful, because it's not you are good or no, or you improve, no. You improve a rate, you improve, yeah? And you can take decisions with this very quantitative aspect. If you have taken, for example, Concerta with a good response, the first idea is to change to LDX at the moment, yeah? That is the most intuitive. And the other, if after change the drug you don't have good response, sure, apply to use together a psychological treatment. Yeah.
We should have one of adolescents coming off medication quite rapidly, 15 years onwards. You know, and stressing that was a good idea. Is there a group that always go around with symptoms that are reasonable for to off that patient at that age?
Yeah, that is one of, to me, is one of the most important aspects that we have at the moment, this transition period. Because adolescence is a normal moment, obviously, of the life of the people, yeah? But for ADHD and other disorder, it's a risky period of time. And clinicians can observe that hyperactivity decrease, for example. Some clinicians can say, okay, ADHD is get up, it's not necessary to continue the treatment, and probably it's the period of time that is more necessary to maintain the treatment, all the treatment, psychological treatment, pharmacological treatment. And for that, if you imagine a patient start the treatment during early childhood, during 7, 8 years old, and each year visit psychiatrists, psychologists, and ADHD, taking drugs. It's tough, it's complicated. And for that, when they arrive to adolescence, say, oh, I don't want that. And it's necessary during childhood to use psychoeducation, explain what is the treatment, what means the treatment, and it's necessary to establish a very good relationship with the patient, because they will arrive to adolescence, and talk before the adolescent about drugs, substance use disorder. Because substance use disorder never started during the 16 years old, 17 years old. It started previously in ADHD, 14, 13, 12, and we need to talk about drugs. What means drugs? Now it's a huge controversy for adolescents. Imagine, in Washington state, cannabis is not forbidden. In California, it's the same. In Uruguay, it's the same. Yeah? They can have the idea that cannabis is a safe product. It's the pen. For some people, could be, but not for ADHD. It's a high risk of dependence, and not for children and not for adolescents. 1 of 6 users of cannabis during childhood will have a dependence. 1 of 20 during the adulthood is absolutely different. And that is necessary to explain, to talk, and that is the base to me to maintain the treatment, yes, and to have a good alliance, yeah, with the patient during this critical period of time. Yeah, sure.
Time for just one more question for Tony. Sorry. That man was first, actually.
Thanks very much. My name is Dr. Antonio. Thanks very much for being here. My question is quite personal in the sense that I would have had a very atypical presentation of ADHD or ADD, would be more appropriate for me. And it was further complicated by the fact that my IQ profile is extremely scattered. I don't have a full scale IQ. At 55, highly scattered between my highest and lowest score. I'm just wondering, my question really is, as a diagnostician, how do you deal with that when you have atypical presentations, and how I've got conflicting diagnosis as well, and when the experts can't agree, where does that leave the patient when they're trying to figure this out?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We don't have disorders, we have patients. We have patients, and we need to individualize the treatment to this patient. And what is the impact and the functionality, what aspect is necessary or not. For clinicians, it's very, very important to have in mind that IQ is a variable that we need to manage, because people with high IQ, probably you don't find a lot of impact. But it's an impact of this person, because the functioning could be better, and that is necessary to have in mind and to individualize this. It's very typical, this situation, when you assess childhood, you say, oh, it's not an ADHD because during childhood is not any impact. For this high IQ, all the period of time of primary school or secondary school is not so complicated, yeah? But it's necessary to know. And results to the treatment, psychological or drug treatment, are the same with this population. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that.
Thank you.
Let me not steal any of Dr. Oliver Grimm's next presentation, but we all know that ADHD rarely travels alone. Indeed, one of the objectives of the core COCA project is to look at those comorbidities. And in that regard, we're delighted that Oliver could come and present with us tonight. Dr. Oliver Grimm currently works at the Department of Psychiatry and Psychometrics from the Medicine and Psychotherapy at the Goethe Institute in Frankfurt. And Oliver does research in neuropsychology, cognitive sciences, and biological psychology. His current project is on dopamine reward mechanisms in ADHD. And tonight, Oliver will be talking on ADHD and its comorbidities. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, just need to get rid of that.
You need to go.
Here on this one.
Go down. Yeah, to do.
And then you just need to let me know which one it
Yeah,
is.
okay. Which one was yours again? Going to COCA project?
This one here?
Yeah. Presentations on the one.
And it should be the one that says slideshow.
Yeah, but today, so
That's this one.
today, let's see, yeah, today, 1835.
So, how do we always do the next? Okay, but yes, okay. So, yes, Ken, thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for providing me with this wonderful audience. Not only the audience hall, but it's nice to see so many people. As Ken already said, I'm a clinical psychiatrist. I'm responsible for the outpatient clinic at the University Hospital in Frankfurt, the outpatient clinic for ADHD patients. And my scientific interest is using neuroimaging to understand how the brain works in different psychiatric disorders, especially in ADHD. So my talk is about adult ADHD and its comorbidities. Maybe that's already the punchline, and you can leave the hall, because for some people it's quite new that adult ADHD goes together with comorbidities. So that's maybe just one very simple take-home message. Being from Frankfurt, I have to present these pictures. On the lower right, you see Heinrich Hoffmann, who was the first head of a psychiatric hospital clinic in Frankfurt. And I heard some laughing. I was quite unsure whether people in Ireland know these images. In Germany, it's very well known. So he invented these images, these stories about, not so good childhood behavior to entertain his own children, and that was very successful. So it's not really meant as prototypical for ADHD, but that's how most people understand these stories. So on the top left, you see a young guy fighting not only with his chair, but obviously he's very hyperactive. And on the right, you see a guy who's very inattentive. That might lead to some wet complications. And on the lower left, comorbidity is understood as dissocial behavior. So this very angry young man tortured animals, so on. The question for me is, as I'm an adult psychiatrist, what's the course, what's the trajectory of this childhood behavior? So how do the ADHD symptoms and comorbidities develop in adulthood? And one possibility when looking at hyperactivity is this guy might, for example, because he's very impulsive, and hyperactivity is a form of impulsivity, so maybe he's more prone to start smoking. That was not so common back in the mid-19th century, but nowadays a very prototypical development. Now, what about the top right? Maybe he's very inattentive, and nowadays people use cars, so maybe he has a higher risk for car accidents. Now, when it comes to the comorbidity dissocial behavior in children, a very oversimplistic course or negative outcome would be, well, the patient just go to jail. That sounds funny, but for the minority of patients with such a severe course, it's not funny. So the questions I want to address in my talk and maybe give you some thought-provoking insights into research are first, what are comorbidities? That's maybe trivial, but you can have, let's say you are obese and sometimes you suffer from coughing. So this stuff comes together because both diseases are very common. But nowadays, or in psychiatric research, typically by comorbidity, we mean a disease which is linked by etiology with the primary disorder. So I want to give you an insight into the genetics in my next slide of ADHD to prove that. But that's more a theoretical aspect, so maybe patients or their relative might ask, what does it matter how you call it, ADHD or ADHD comorbid disorder? At best, it helps us better in treatment and developing an individual strategy for the patient. Next question, of course, is how do these comorbidities develop in adult life, or to say it better, the transition from childhood adolescence to adult life. And that's a huge issue in clinical psychiatry, because usually, at least in Germany, and from my German experience, there's a huge gap between child and adolescent psychiatry and adult psychiatry. And somewhere in between, especially young people get lost or come back decades later and have more problems. And for me, as a not only clinician but researcher, of course, I ask myself, is there a common pathway to these comorbidities? So to give it a more, lively example, I present you a case. It's not a true case, it's more invented, and a combination of several patients I saw in the outpatient clinic. So a 30-year-old woman obtained an evaluation for distractibility and general nervousness. That's very unspecific. So she spent the past 10 years at home caring for her children, and now she obtained a part-time work as an assistant manager in a store, and she's excited about the position, especially because it goes well together with the family, flexible work hours, and the opportunity to earn an extra income. So you can read much better English than I do, so I concentrate on the main points. So she now presents in an outpatient clinic because she reports difficulties remaining focused on her job, had general trouble organizing her time, and was in danger of losing her job due to her failure meeting several deadlines. That's very typical. Not all patients have it, but people who are in work life, that's a common situation. So she's tense, irritable, trouble relaxing, problems falling asleep. Her mind goes completely blank when overstressed. She previously, not at the moment, but previously experienced several times depressed mood, loss of pleasure in her usual activities, change of appetite, no suicidal preoccupations. She had in her past a psychotherapy because of depression, and at the moment when she comes, she did not take any medication because of depression. She experienced an episode of binge eating, she says, because out of boredom or frustration, which led to an increase in body weight, especially after she delivered her last child. So she fulfills the criteria for obesity coming from the body mass index. She's a bit frustrated about this. The patient reported that she was considered a good student and so on. So coming from her life story, ADHD seems to make sense. For example, her marriage is typical, generally stable and satisfying, but sometimes problems because of financial stresses and child rearing. And interestingly, one of her children, a 6-year-old boy, had been diagnosed with ADHD. Sometimes patients, adult patients, come to me and said, I had no idea about ADHD, but I was with my child. We visited a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And then suddenly it came to me, same problems with me. Sometimes they said, I took a pill from my child. And then, it's a common story, and I wouldn't overrate it, but it's so typical. So that's not a real severe case, and every patient is different. But I want to show you with this is that this patient does not only suffer from adult ADHD, but she has a history of depressive episodes, and she suffers from obesity. From a clinical perspective, that's not a real severe case. So she copes quite well with her life. There are some critical situations. So just to remind you, you probably heard about this, how many people suffer from ADHD. On the left, you see numbers from several different countries, and in the end, that's a common meta-analysis from 2007. In the end, it turned out about 3.4% prevalence. In newer data, it's a little bit depending on the geographic location, but all in all, the message is the geographic location does not play such a huge role. So the worldwide average prevalence for adult ADHD may be 2.8, highest prevalence in high-income countries, and of course that might be simply because high-income countries have more services available where the diagnosis is made. The persistent rate from childhood to adolescence is maybe something around 60%, and that really depends on how you make the diagnosis or how you define the threshold. And on the very bottom, this small equation points to a problem. I don't want to go in detail, but it's quite interesting when we compare the prevalence rate in adult and in children, and we say maybe 60% have persistent ADHD. It does not fit very well together with the number or the prevalence rate in adult ADHD. For some reason, people with adult ADHD do not have a previous diagnosis of ADHD in childhood. We don't know yet where they come from. They exist. I see some of them in the outpatient clinic, but that's still something where research has to find out. So as I said, I wanted to give you some insight about genetic correlations, and genetic correlation means it's not about environmental factors, but that's already adjusted for. So the genetic epidemiologists nowadays have huge studies, in this case a mega-analysis with more than 20,000 ADHD cases. And the question is, people with a risk for ADHD, what's the chance that on a genetic level this correlates, or they have a higher risk that it correlates with other phenotypes, as the geneticists say. And a phenotype is not necessarily a disease, but it can be something other. So I will present you what I mean with this. So on the left you see more in orange the risk for people with a kind of genetic ADHD risk. They have a higher risk of being smokers. They have a higher risk of smoking more cigarettes per day. And sadly, of course, that correlates with lung cancer. So obviously the link is not that the genes which may be predisposed to ADHD have a direct effect leading to lung cancer, but it's obvious that these genes shape behavior in a way that people smoke more, and as a consequence of this, they develop lung cancer. Of course, that's not a fate, but it's simply a genetic statistic. And another interesting genetic correlation you see on the right. In blue, several measures like body mass index, hip circumference, waist to hip ratio, being overweight, obesity, defined in 3 classes, have clearly a higher genetic correlation with ADHD risk genes. And in green, you see there is a genetic correlation with neuroticism. Neuroticism sounds like psychoanalysis. It's more or less, to point it in a very simple way, people react with emotional instability in face of stressors. And of course, that has something to do with depressive symptoms. So there's clearly a genetic correlation, but that does not prove any mechanism. It just shows on a very basic level, when talking about comorbidities, it's not only adult ADHD, but this goes together with other things. As I said, smoking and lung cancer, depression and obesity, and several other aspects. So I'm very interested in the neuroimaging of the reward system. So dopamine is something you need for motivation. As Tony already mentioned, dopamine plays a role in the treatment of ADHD. So there's something called a reward center, consisting mainly of the dopaminergic innervated brain parts, for example, the ventral tegmental area or the striatum, For the part of the audience which still remember old televisions, sometimes you had to adjust the antenna to get a better signal, to get a better picture. Or you could choose to adjust a knob for contrast. And in a way, dopamine is this contrast knob in your brain. And sometimes if you have not such a good picture in your brain television, you can try to adjust the contrast. But that does not always work. Sometimes it gets worse. But that's a reason why we have very simple, or why we can influence this simple brain circuit, because it's built or like in the scheme on the left. So to put a complex story very short, dopamine is relayed after a reward. So that's what already common knowledge is. Some people read it in newspapers. So if you eat interesting stuff, chocolate or whatever, it's in a way like a drug. Maybe that's a bit of oversimplification. But you need the signal, even if you're just a chocolate addict and not a drug addict, in your everyday life, because it's a learning signal. You learn, for example, within this paper of chocolate, there's something interesting. And imagine animals in animal life, for them, knowing about such stimuli is very important. So dopamine is something you really need in your everyday life. You need it for recognizing wealth. Some people or drugs, you can say, hijack the whole system, and people feel pleasure, but in reality their life situation is awful. Social stimuli like this cute baby are strong stimuli for dopamine secretion, and of course fast food. Maybe that goes together with obesity. Let's see. So in the COCA project, we're interested in studying dopaminergic regulations in adults with ADHD. So how to do that? We just present people in an fMRI scanner a so-called conditioned stimulus, some sign in this smiley. Then they have to press a button, and then we reward them, or we tell them you were too slow and do not reward them. And then we look with fMRI at their brain, and here you see with this blue cross a specific structure in the brain, and that's a striatum. So we can really image the reaction of the reward center. And the common theory behind it, patients with ADHD show less activation than controls. Why less? So a common explanation is people with ADHD need more input, like they move more, they need more input. I will go into some details of this input to kind of come from a lower level on the same level like a neuronormal adult. So what we want to do in the COCA project, we want to do neuroimaging in people with ADHD and obesity, ADHD and substance use disorder, and ADHD and depression. That's something, to get this number, we want to collaborate. I don't have any results so far, but we are one of the first to systematically look into the neuroimaging of ADHD and comorbidities. So on this slide, you see some examples of the comorbidity spectrum of ADHD, and it's not complete. So obviously, as we already heard, adult ADHD goes together with substance use disorder, some personality disorders, anxiety disorders, antisocial personality disorder, autism, obesity, bipolar disorder, or major depression. There, I could extend this list, but in green I highlighted those diseases where we know that a dopaminergic dysregulation plays a major role. So I will say some things about obesity, major depression, and substance use disorder. So Here we see from a study from 2007 that ADHD has a higher risk for mood, anxiety, and substance use disorder. And while these tables might look boring, they have important information. On the top right, you see in the column OR the so-called odds ratio, which means you have 4 times the risk of having mood anxiety disorder or substance use disorder if you suffer from ADHD, or to rephrase it, your risk is increased by 300%. And on the lower left, this table tries to figure out what occurred first, ADHD or the other disorder. So for mood disorders, usually 85% it was ADHD first. In anxiety disorders, it was half-half. And in substance use disorders, almost 100% had ADHD before substance use disorders started. So that gives us an idea about the causality, or how the development over the lifespan. Okay, and just to shortly get into this, of course, it's highly interesting to look at sex-specific comorbidity patterns. Men and women are not completely comparable, especially when it comes to psychiatric disorders, or the prevalence rate in children is different. As you know, usually hyperkinetic behavior is more seen in the boys, and they have a little higher prevalence rate. So here we see that mood disorder and anxiety disorder and eating disorder are more prevalent in patients, female patients suffering from ADHD, while substance use disorder is more overrepresented in males. So the hypothesis behind this, at least from my perspective, I don't know whether it's true, probably an oversimplification, the dopamine dysregulation is the common pathway, and as such it's found in a variety of comorbid disorders. There is some data looking at depression and anhedonia, where people were put into a fMRI scanner, and the signal in the reward center was lower than in normal controls. Same with obesity, and the same to some degree with substance use disorder. So it seems like the direction in the brain, that the reward system is not so reacting so fast, is the same direction as in patients with ADHD. So this speaks for the hypothesis that the dopaminergic deficit is at the core of the disease. So now let's look at obesity, and that's from 2 tables from a very interesting and comprehensive study from 2016, a meta-analysis which said the risk for obesity is increased by about 40% in adults. However, the studies are very heterogeneous. You find studies where the risk is even lower, and some studies where the risk is much, much higher. That might be because the studies are just from different populations. In the end, the punchline in from these tables is that for medicated individuals with ADHD, the risk is more or less not increased or different, while in unmedicated individuals with ADHD, it's higher. So depression and ADHD, or quality of life and ADHD, is a huge issue. So we already saw people with ADHD have a higher risk for depression. But where does it come from? And there was this small study from Korea. In fact, I think it was about 200 Korean soldiers. When they enter military service, they are characterized by psychiatrists, questionnaires, and so on. And it became clear from this small study that adult ADHD does not directly affect the quality of life. Their below the arrow, you see 0.1. So there is not a high correlation, but the correlation comes with a step in between, and that's depression. So it seems like the quality of life is highly influenced by depressive symptoms. So comorbid depression significantly impacts on quality of life, and to some degree we can say methylphenidate maybe prevents depression. In this study, a huge number of individuals, number of patients, almost 40,000, were compared, those with medication and those without medication, and it became clear that the relative risk was about 0.54 for having depression. So it's lower, it's about almost 50% lower developing depression in for patients with ADHD. A problem in these epidemiological studies is always that it's not a systematic comparison. So maybe patients with ADHD and medication who take their medication regularly have a different characteristics. So I will skip this. Substance use disorder is a very important problem in clinical psychiatry. I just want to point out one aspect of this slide. So on the lower left, you see the rate of controls in the rate of substance use disorders in controls, and in people with ADHD, it's much higher. But there is a difference in people with untreated and treated ADHD. So coming from these epidemiological studies, it seems like treatment has a beneficial effect. I will skip this. That's an important thing. Traffic accidents. Coming from Swedish registry studies, it seems like that people with ADHD, and sadly I have to say men, women are just better drivers. Men have a higher risk of traffic, serious transport accidents. In women, it's not completely true what I said. In women, the rate is higher too, but interestingly, the medication in this study men seem to benefit better from medication than women. It's not clear why, but at least medication made a difference. So when looking at criminality, Tony already showed us this slide. So it seems like a bit comparable to traffic accidents. Men have a higher risk for criminality. I don't want to make any funny jokes about this because coming out of prison can be a serious problem for patients with ADHD, but it seems like that treatment has a beneficial effect. So the mortality rate in patients with ADHD is a bit higher. And mainly that's because of unnatural causes of death, especially accidents. I just wanted to change my slides and include a picture I just received 2 hours ago from a patient. She said, I cannot continue in the clinical study because I broke my leg, and as a proof, she took with her smartphone photos from her broken leg. Of course, that sounds funny, but that's how impairment in everyday life looks like. I will skip this. So this is really the kind of take-home message. That's how we nowadays think about development of comorbidities in adult life. So starting from childhood, going to adolescence and adulthood, it seems like several different health problems, psychological functions, or risky behaviors develop. That's a very complex question, and Tony already answered some questions about treatment. So to put it very simple, you have to weigh whether the comorbidity is the most important thing, for example, substance use disorder. If alcohol abuse is so important or so problematic at the point you do not treat ADHD, but maybe when the patient is stabilized. So that's this algorithm about waiting. And just to mention two non-pharmacological treatments we do in the COCA study, we have a pilot randomized controlled phase 2A trial on the prevention of comorbid depression and comorbidity, where the idea is we compare a bright light therapy program, our fitness program, which is implemented with the help of a smartphone and a special app and a sensor device, and compare it to treatment as usual over 10 weeks. That's an ongoing trial at the moment. One problem of this trial I already mentioned for some patients, not only because of broken legs, but because it's not so easy to keep everything in mind. It's complicated, and maybe for some of them medication is easier. And that's a new idea of treating impulsivity in adults with the help of probiotics. So impulsivity is typical for ADHD. Not every patient has huge impulsivity. Sometimes we see impulsivity in other psychiatric disorders, for example, borderline personality disorder. The idea is that the composition of the microbiome, the bacteria in your brain, they in a way influence how your brain reacts to stimuli, how your cognition works. And if we do not impact directly on the brain, but on the microbiome in the gut, maybe we can influence impulsive behavior. That sounds maybe astonishing for some of them, for some of you, but that has been clearly shown in animal models. So that's almost the end. I just, if you're interested in catching up with the latest topics in research on ADHD and related disorders, maybe you have a look at our blog, Mind the Gap, where several researchers of these projects contribute, and it's written in a, I think, very stimulating way, and it's not only for a scientific audience, but for lay persons too. So thank you for your attention.
So again, I'd like to thank Oliver for that talk. What I'd like to say, one thing that comes out of me for that talk is the seriousness of ADHD. You've seen the comorbidities. You can see what can happen. I think the information that we're getting here today puts a light to the fact that it's something trivial. ADHD is a condition, and it's a serious condition, and it needs to be treated. That message needs to go from beyond here to the people that are in power, the people that control the money. And we need to get this message out, and we need to get it further. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions for Oliver? There's a lady in the middle there, if somebody has a microphone.
I'm quite good at shouting, so I need a microphone. My name is Marion Nupton, and I'm a psychologist, and I often get inquiries from adults, and they've been doing research on the internet, and they say, I think I might have brain fog, or I think I might have sluggish brain syndrome. I don't know where exactly they're getting these things, but I had one of those calls today, and I was wondering if people in the ADHD world are aware that possibly people who have ADHD and are looking for diagnosis or assessment are finding things on the internet that might divert them in the wrong direction or give them the wrong name for something that might be ADHD.
Do you fear that the label brain fog would divert them, or maybe it's the first step for looking for a psychiatrist and seeking treatment.
Yeah, I think it could bring them in for assessment, but what I'd be worried about is that they sometimes already have some treatments or some ideas as to how to fix the problem from websites they're looking at.
I think that's very common, at least from my experience from Germany, from Frankfurt. A lot of my patients presenting in our adult ADHD outpatient clinic have ideas from the internet, and you cannot avoid it. So there are organized groups, discussions, blogs, and so on, where they get lots of useful information. Sometimes you find quite good information from pharmaceutical companies on the internet. Of course, some patients say, I don't trust them. And on the discussion, I don't know the English word, blogs or so on, where patients discuss, sometimes I find the information there fantastic, and within the next lines, it's completely nonsense. But how to deal with it? I speak with my patients about it. Sometimes it costs extra time, but of course it's interesting to know what their disease model is. Do they believe it's brain fog, or some neurotransmitter disorder, or is it fate by God, or the genes, or was it my mother? I think that's really a part of the assessment of the patient to get an idea about this, his disease model.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about the bright light therapy that you said? Trying something out.
Thank you. I already ran out of time, so I just went over bright light therapy. The idea is that people with adult ADHD have a kind of disorganized sleeping pattern. And there are even some researchers who say that that's one of the core deficits of ADHD. That's still a matter of debate. I think maybe that's too much. But a lot of my patients typically sometimes go too late to bed, have trouble getting into a kind of real boring organized schedule. And bright light therapy is investigated already. We have some evidence for depressive disorder, especially for seasonal depression, and the idea is always the same. If people wake up and we give them a strong signal, daylight starts now, then the brain adjusts to this regular rhythm. Might make sense to use bright light therapy to prevent depressive disorders, but I think it might even help some patients to get into a regular schedule. And whether that's the light or if they are forced because of our study we have the smartphone app, and sometimes the smartphone says, did you use your bright light therapy? And they have to fill out a questionnaire. I think in the end the result is the same. They are forced in a pattern. And even, it sounds awful, we force patients into a pattern, but for some of them it's really helpful. So that's the idea behind bright light therapy.
Can you tell us a bit about the probiotic, right? What kind of things people are supposed to eat, or they give these animals?
Okay. What kind of is, to be honest, beyond my knowledge. I'm a bit involved in this project, but the basic experiment behind this is it sounds wonderful. You transplant, so to say, feces from one animal to another animal, and you transplant feces from an animal which shows a very hyperactive and impulsive behavior to a normal animal, mice, rats, typically in these experiments. And suddenly the animal with the new microbiome in his gut develops this hyperactive behavior. So this was the starting point of getting an idea that the composition of the microbiome in the gut has a huge impact on behavior. And how to modify this? Of course, the idea is in some of the more expensive dairy products, you find these bacteria and a special mix of these bacteria that's in the treatment arm in this study. But whether that's really the best mix or whether just eating expensive dairy products is the solution, I think that's still the question for a systematic evaluation with a clinical trial. At least we have really the idea that it makes sense to direct the gut microbiome and try to change by nutrition something. And of course, it might work the other way around, that people who eat a lot of fast food or who have an unhealthy eating behavior, that these people change indirectly their behavior.
Hello, my name is Niall Green. I'm a director of Adhd HDMA and I'm a psychotherapist also. I was wondering, had you any experience with internet gaming disorder? ADHD seems to be a huge correlation there.
That's a good question. I see patients, of course, most of them young males, who have a highly problematic behavior. The whole concept of internet gaming disorder, as it's not a substance involved in this kind of addiction, is a little bit problematic to diagnose. There are some studies showing that ADHD is a risk for this, but it's just the systematic work on this is just beginning. And from my experience, I did not see so many patients presenting with this. The problem in clinical practice is still the same as on this algorithm I showed you. You have to wait. Is classical ADHD the most important part, or this problematic behavior? And I had a patient who spent 8 hours per day playing, I don't know, fantastic online games I did not understand. And it was quite obvious that this patient really profited from a course of cognitive behavioral therapy, and medication was not the first-line treatment for this. So that's my question to your answer. You have to wait it.
Okay, thank you very much to Oliver for that presentation. Just before we get to the next presentation, I'd like to have a quick ad break. So just as I've mentioned earlier, my name is Ken. I'm from Adhd Ireland. We're a small charity and our function is to help support people with ADHD. We run support groups for adults, as there's Niall there. We run them in the 26 counties. We have one coming up next Tuesday night in the Carmichael Centre. If anybody hasn't come to one before, I see there is some people here previously, but everybody is, of course, more than welcome. If you'd like to volunteer to help us support a support group around the country somewhere, if Nicola could put her hand up there, she'd be more than happy to talk to you at any particular time. One of the issues we do find is there's a lack of understanding with teachers. So we're running a parent training or teacher training course next month. Good news is, from our perspective, it's sold out. We'll be running another one in September, so if you're interested in that, please do let us know. We're also starting an EU research project ourselves with the School of Computer Science in developing augmented reality tools for children. So if you have a child who's currently 9, 10 or 11 and they have a diagnosis of ADHD and you'd like to take part in the study, we have forms outside. And obviously, just as we are a small charity and we've put this event on for free, and again, big thanks to Cora and the COCO project for getting involved and coming and presenting for us today. But if you can't help us by putting something in the bucket outside, we do appreciate it. For our final speaker tonight, we're very happy to have Margot Wrigley. And Margot Wrigley is the Clinical Director for the HSE for Adult Services in HSE. So while Tony and Oliver give us a very good overview of ADHD and its comorbidities, to get the view of what's happening in Ireland, I think is very important. And to do that, I'd like to welcome Margot Wrigley.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that introduction, and indeed for inviting me back to speak to you again about what we're trying to do in Ireland. As Ken said, I'm a psychiatrist, and I've worked for many years in the public services in Ireland in a management role as well as a clinical role. And until May of last year, I was the National Clinical Advisor for the Mental Health Services here in Ireland, and my job was really twofold. One was to see where there were gaps or deficits in services, and the second one was then to design a solution. ADHD was something I had previously identified when I was the medical director in charge of the services in North Dublin as being a major deficit. So that's what led to the interest in, or the identification of that area. This doesn't seem to be moving. All right. It's not fully open, I don't think. Yeah, sure, please. I don't think it's fully open.
Is the new version on?
That's the right one, actually. Yeah.
There's a window up in the upper corner that you might have to get rid of.
So where?
It's not really from slideshow. You should be able to press that, but it's not letting me press it.
Okay. It's a PowerPoint, yeah, but there's a. Can you connect out? Click out. Click out. We'll start again. Okay. When we tried it earlier.
Did it?
Yes, worked perfectly. We tried it earlier. No, we're in PowerPoint.
He said if we just click view slideshow, that would work.
No, see, it's not a slideshow, it's a PDF, you see. So. Where do you get into files on this? It's in the Finder.
Yeah. So it's the first one.
Yeah, today. No. Oh, sorry, is it?
Should be that first.
Oh, sorry, yeah,
It's the
sorry,
very
yeah,
first one
yeah,
there,
sorry,
yeah.
I can't see from sideways.
No, it's alright.
Yeah. There we go.
I think maybe is it possible to scroll?
You scroll over the manager down.
No, here we go. Shit.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much indeed. So just to say something about what the clinical programs are, there are a number of clinical programs that have been developed by the HSE over the past 8 years, and there are 5 of them in mental health. This seems to have a life of its own now. So as I was saying, what we had identified was that the provision of services for adults with ADHD was a gap as opposed to an area for improvement. The clinical programs are a collaborative approach between the mental health division, obviously because this is a mental health area, clinical strategy and program division within the HSE, working in close collaboration with the College of Psychiatrists in Ireland. And when we started this in autumn of 2016, we established a working group which was multidisciplinary, so all disciplines that are involved in the mental health service teams represented on the working group. And a key part of it was we had service user input. And Adhd Ireland very kindly nominated Kate Carr-Fanning to be our service user input. And that's made a huge difference for many reasons as to how we've designed this clinical program. So we had to justify why we were choosing ADHD in adults as being a clinical program, and I'll talk about that. The impact of having ADHD on adults, some of it my earlier colleagues have covered, so I'll whip through that. Talk about the response in Europe and more specifically in Ireland, a little bit about the assessment process, the individualised care planning process, and then an update on the progress we've made since Ken asked me to talk here in October, which I would just say is only 5 months ago in my defence. So as my colleagues have said earlier, it's a very common disorder. It's widely recognised in children, but it continues to have symptoms in whole or part in about 2/3 of children with the problem. It's classified as a neurodevelopment disorder rather than a mental illness. And its recognition in children goes back a long way. The first medical description was by a paediatrician called Still in 1902, and it was first treated in 1937. And the mainstay of treatment at the moment has been in use for over 50 years, and that's methylphenidate. It was first recognised in adults. I don't know how to get rid of this unless I do something dodgy, like click on the cross. Would that be a bit dodgy? I'll leave it, I think. But it was first described in adults by Woods in 1976. But having said that, it took a very long time for countries really to respond, or public services, health services, to respond to the fact that this condition does persist into adulthood. So, as you've heard, there are similar symptoms in adults as there are to children, but there may be a difference in the balance. So, for instance, hyperactivity isn't as obvious in adults, but the inattention becomes more of a problem. It's associated with impacts on the person's ability to function in many domains. It has a similar pattern of comorbidity, and we've heard a lot about that from Oliver. It has similar responses to stimulant medication. There are lots of evidence for that now, and similar cognitive performance measures are seen in children as in adults. It's unrecognized and untreated, and that causes a lot of distress to people, to their families, their partners, and to others around them. It impairs ability to function at work and in really all domains of life. And it does cause a lot of problems, or can cause problems with relationships. And the key areas there, or the key symptoms there, are to do with the volatility of mood, or the lability of mood, which I think is very common really in adults with ADHD. And sometimes people can get caught up in antisocial behavior and drug and alcohol abuse. The public service response in Ireland is provided through the child and adolescent mental health teams, and there are 67 of those covering all catchment areas within the country. But there is no formal health service response within the public mental health services in Ireland, but for the response in Sligo Leitrim, which was led by a very good colleague of mine, Demetrius Thadamas, who is still sitting in the back, I think. Yeah. So just to identify him, based on research, but he has extended it into a service, and that's really important that we have that expertise within the country. So we've heard already about how common the condition is in adults. There is a difference in gender distribution between children and adults, with 4 boys to 1 girl, and then it changes to 2 men to 1 woman in adulthood, and it may even be more like 1 to 1. And that's really, I think, there are a number of explanations for it, but one is that the hyperactivity, which is common in boys with ADHD, means it comes to everyone's attention much more, because they're said to be disruptive in class, etc., than the girls who have problems with their attention. But as you grow older, the hyperactivity does seem to wane a bit, but the inattention causes problems when you're trying to live an independent adult life. The other bit of evidence I think that is really important is that if you look, there have been a lot of studies looking at people who attend mental health services, some of them for many years, and how many of those have unrecognized ADHD. And in 7 EU countries, the rate was 1 in 10 to 1 in 5. And these are people who don't have what are called psychotic illnesses. In other words, they don't suffer from schizophrenia, but they are presenting with problems like anxiety, depression, problems with personality, substance misuse, etc. There was a very nice study done in the UK at 4 different services, and they found a rate of current attenders of mental health services who don't have psychosis of 15%, so that's 1 in 6. And this was a time when there weren't that many services in the UK, so they were found to have ADHD, but it hadn't been recognized. They had been diagnosed as having problems like anxiety, depression, cyclothymia, etc. And then, of course, there's the evidence that we have an increased rate. There is an increased rate in the prison population. Overall, 25% more in men than in women, but still higher in both men and women who are in prison. So, a common problem. What causes it? The genetic evidence has also been touched on. So, if you're a child, if you're an adult with ADHD, one in 2 of your children are likely to have ADHD. If you're a child with ADHD, you've got a 1 in 4 likelihood that one of your parents has ADHD. So that's very strong genetic evidence, stronger than any other evidence in terms of mental health problems. It's now clear that it's related to not so much a neurotransmitter deficit, but dysregulation, particularly dopamine, also noradrenaline, and environmental factors are also important. And I've listed some of them there. The one you can't see is severe adversity, and it's to do with children brought up in orphanages, specifically over a number of years ago, if you remember, the children who grew up in Romanian orphanages who had not been touched, looked after in cots, etc. And when they were followed up, there was an increased, a higher than expected level of ADHD in those children. So that sort of adversity does cause problems. So the impact on adults, in terms of the core symptoms, inattention is a big problem in adults. It causes problems with forgetfulness, being very disorganized. The hyperactivity, in terms of physical hyperactivity, isn't as obvious, but you do notice sometimes that people butt in. So if they're talking to someone, they don't let people finish their sentences, and they might just butt in because they're so interested in putting across their own point of view. It can also be seen in things like being quite fidgety, so people who fidget with their hands or with their feet, or who twiddle their hair a lot. That's the kind of hyperactivity presenting in adulthood. The impulsivity, I should have said, was butting in. And hyperactivity and impulsivity are quite linked, as you can see. To make a diagnosis, you do need to be able to recognize in the person impairment in at least 2 of what are called the functional domains, and we've heard about those earlier today. And there's quite a range of those, but work, or if you're a student, college, so academic work, how you spend your leisure time is important, social interactions with people, relationships with families and friends, partners, how you manage your money. There may be huge problems there in sort of keeping track of money or spending it impulsively. We've heard about driving. and also offending behaviour. There are other symptoms that aren't considered to be core symptoms, but they do have a very profound effect on people. And one is procrastination, so a lot of thinking about what you want to do and how you might do it, but difficulty actually getting started, and sometimes not getting started or being so late getting started that you find that you're late for doing things. Very low frustration and, being a bit volatile because of that, and that can be seen in lability of mood. Needless worrying, all the time worrying about things and, feeling unhappy inside about that. Low self-esteem is extremely common. And one thing that there's a lot of work starting, particularly a number of people have an interest in it, is involuntary mind wandering. So I suppose the easiest way to describe that is if you've lots of people, I should say, decide that things are boring, and you might find me boring and be thinking about something else, and I'm sorry if you do. But sometimes people will actually, make a good intention. They've gone somewhere, maybe they want to list their a student, they're going to a lecture, and they're making all sorts of good intentions to keep attending, and before they know where they are, they've wandered off somewhere else. It's the end of the lecture and they haven't even noticed what's been said. So really that's what involuntary mind wandering is about, and it's very common in adults with ADHD. And insomnia is also very well recognised in children and in adults. And I think, Oliver, you were talking about one form, which is delayed phase sleep disorder, related to, it's now been shown, abnormalities, the slower release of melatonin, which controls sleep. And it can be very disabling as well, because if you can't get up in the morning, it has a very it's very difficult to live your life to the full. So you either have to become someone who sort of starts working at night and chooses an occupation in that way. But there are no hopeful ways of dealing with it to do with melatonin and also behaviour around sleep. And the important thing is getting up at the same time rather than focusing on going to bed early. And with melatonin that can be helpful too. So that's the sort of impact. But I do think, and I was saying it before when I was talking in October, that there are extremely positive effects of having ADHD. I think possibly the way we live our modern lives doesn't make as much use of the talents people with ADHD have, but there are lots, they're well documented, and if you look them up on the internet, you'll see them listed. But you probably recognize them. For those people with ADHD, they'll recognize them, or if you're family members, you'll recognize those. So people can be very creative. They have an amazing ability to focus in a laser-like manner in something they're interested in. And that really allows great productivity in work if they're working in an area where that sort of focus is required. Persistence as well. So, these are the people who, are so interested in something, they want to keep highlighting it, and they can do that very well because they have huge persistence as part of their personality. There are people with ADHD can also be very quick to react, so they're very good in certain jobs where you have to, and I gave the example the last time of the fire service, they make very good fire workers because it's excitement, having to do something, react quickly, etc. So that sort of job suits people very well. But the other thing that I think is demonstrated and has been shown is linked with ADHD is the ability to think laterally. So most people think in straight lines, and sometimes you need to be able to think laterally to come up with a solution to a problem. And that's something people with ADHD have been shown to be rather good at. The other thing is, which can seem a little bit contrary when I've talked about people butting in on conversations and talking too much, but there's also the bit about being very sensitive to other people, because if you've got ADHD, it's a difficult thing to live with. You can have had a lot of problems as a child and as an adult, and it does make you very sensitive to other people, and that too has been demonstrated. And some of the pictures here are of famous people who've admitted that they've got ADHD, but of course not Churchill, he didn't, because we didn't really know about it then. But I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So those are the positive impacts, and it's important to focus on that, because when we're talking about recognizing ADHD in people and providing them with treatment, it's in a way so they can realize their potential, because there are a lot of positive sides to ADHD as well. So the response in Europe and Ireland, and there's been reference already to the seminal piece of work that was done by the European, I'm not very good at pronouncing the name, but I think it's Cooge, maybe one of my co-presenters would be able to correct me on that. This paper that was multi-authored paper that was produced about 8 years ago, and this was looking at the response to ADHD in adults across Europe and Ireland. So you'll notice Ireland was one of the countries there. And the findings I've listed there, that it is, as you know, a lifelong condition. It was at that time underdiagnosed in most European countries, but I think there's been advances in the meantime in most countries, but not yet ours. It impairs the quality of life of the person with it and those around it. It causes distress and impairment. And then there are the longer term studies, and you can see the impact on friends and in work, in academics, etc. So I've talked about that already. And I suppose the other thing they recognised, which is important really, I think, particularly in Ireland, at the moment, the stage we're at in terms of developing service, is that there is stigma in general. If you say you've ADHD and you're an adult, people tend to think you're just making excuses for yourself, that it doesn't exist, that everyone grows out of it, etc. But there is sadly also a stigma against the diagnosis amongst professionals, those of us who are professionals as well. And that's a challenge for those of us who want to ensure that services are provided. So the situation in Ireland, there have been 2 studies that have been very helpful in terms of making the case for developing a clinical programme. And one was carried out 9 years ago in the North Dublin Mental Health Services, and that was by Saeed, and he's used the Adhd that has been referred to earlier. It's just a 6-item questionnaire that people fill in themselves, and these were people who were attending the mental health services in North Dublin. And he found that 23% screened positive. Now, screening positive is not the same as having a diagnosis, but it's interesting, isn't it? And then Demetrius, my colleague who I referred to earlier, in recent times has done a more detailed screening in adults attending the mental health services in Sligo Leitrim. And he used the WERS, the Wendo-Utor rating scale, looking retrospectively at people with diagnosis who or trying to pick up on childhood ADHD, and then also current symptoms using the longer version of ours as well. And 21% of adults attending the mental health services, and some of them have been attending for as long as 7 or 8 years, are screened positive for ADHD. And he's at the moment undertaking diagnostic assessments. And if you want to ask him about that, I'm sure he'd happily tell you what he's found. So what I can say about the situation in Ireland is that there is evidence that we're no different to any other European country or Australia or New Zealand. But we are different in that there are virtually no services in place, apart from the service in Sligo Leitrim, which developed from the research that Demetrius has carried out, and he did this without any additional resources. So it's a credit to him to have done that, because it's strong evidence for us. So why is it more difficult to make a diagnosis in adults? And I suppose the main reason really has to do with the comorbidity that Oliver was referring to. So people will come and they'll say things like, they're feeling depressed, they're anxious, problems with their mood, and they'll describe difficulties with their everyday life. So you'll find that people will be diagnosed as having depression, anxiety, and indeed they may have that as well, because there's high rates of comorbidity, as we've heard. dysthymia, so sort of a general dissatisfaction with life. They're not doing well, so they may actually receive a diagnosis of personality disorder, emotionally unstable personality disorder, or they may present with substance use disorder, and we've heard about that earlier too as well. So the assessment process then is very much a clinical assessment, and the important thing is to have a very detailed interview with the person, to also get history from other people who know them. And with children, it's parents. With adults, with the consent of the person. If they're a young adult, it may be parents. If they're older, it may be partners. It may be other family members, such as brothers or sisters, depending on who's around. And I've asterisked their school reports, because lots of people keep their school reports, or their mums keep their school reports, and they can be extremely revealing. Things like, you know, he's very disruptive in class, or she never seems to concentrate, she's always looking out the window. Those sorts of comments can be a key. We're recommending within the clinical program that the DIVA is used for this assessment, and that will also specifically look for functional impairments and the comorbidities as well. There are lots of advantages to that which have already been described to us by Tony, but one of the things is, I have 5 minutes left, so I'll have to, thank you very much, Ken. I hope you didn't count the bits that you were... Okay. So anyway, you took that out, okay, good. So we're recommending the DIVA. We're recommending, part of the assessment is going to be a post-assessment discussion, and that's really important for people because people will have all sorts of feelings about it. Lots of people are pleased, but then later they may be quite bereaved or angry that they have this diagnosis and the impact it's had on their life. And I would just say there, if the person doesn't have ADHD, they also need to have this discussed with them and to be signposted in the right direction. We're very keen that people would have an individual care plan. In other words, they are the architects working with you. It's a shared plan. Looking at specific medication, treatment of comorbid mental health problems, but also non-pharmacological interventions. And we've included this in the clinical program, which is psychoeducation, using a cognitive behavior therapy approach. We're very interested in the one that's developed by Susie Young and Jessica Brahms, even more so because Jessica actually has moved over to UCD, so we hope we'll be able to work with her. And we also think that if people can develop can have a training in concrete skills to help them plan and organise more of an occupational therapy approach, that would be useful. What we have developed, Ken asked me to talk about progress, what we have developed or expanded on in the clinical program now is the contribution of non-health service agencies, and Adhd Ireland Ken in person has been very helpful in giving us a list of the sorts of things that they might be able to work, because what we'd like to do is if a person has a diagnosis that we can say, this is what we can help you with if you want, but we also would recommend you contact Adhd Ireland, and they will also help you with information, support, education, the webinars, and so on. We're also very interested in coaching, and at the last meeting I met Heather Blackmore, and she gave Fiona and I a very nice piece, and we've included that in that. And there are other things there that I have listed for you. So just to run through the progress we've made since October, we've completed the second draft, which is a lot more detailed in terms of the interventions. We've also got a section on the education that's required, and there is a huge amount of education required for those of us working in the mental health services at the moment, because people who train in child and adolescent psychiatry, specifically the psychiatrists, and people training in psychiatry of learning disability is one of their core competencies is assessment and treatment for ADHD. Those of us working in the adult specialties, either with working age adults or older adults, known as general adult psychiatry, psychiatry of old age, it is there's no training for that. So we're working with the college, and we hope that that will become a core competency that will be required for that. And likewise with the bodies for the other disciplines, so it's more generalized. So we've designed a model of care for Ireland, and I'll have a slide just to look at that. We've submitted our second draft to the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, which has set up a clinical advisory group to make sure what we're recommending is in line with best evidence base. The chair of the clinical advisory group is Alan Murta, who's a psychiatrist who actually works privately, but he did work in the public service and worked with me in North Dublin, and he is he runs a service, so he's a lot of practical experience in this area, as well as Demetrius working in the public service. And that clinical advisory group has already had it started meeting. So we're very pleased that we've got as far as that. I mentioned in October that we were hopeful we'd get $1 million allocated by the Mental Health Division, and that has come to pass. So Fiona Reardon, also sitting next to Demetrius at the back, is the program manager, and she and I have been working on, in the context of the model of care, what's the best thing to do. And what we hope to do is to develop 2 services, pilot services, and also provide some additional resources for the Sligo Leitrim service. The data set that I referred to before, which is to capture clinical activity in terms of numbers attending, their problems, outcomes, etc., that was done in October, and it'll act as an oversight mechanism to monitor implementation. But more importantly, the data has actually been piloted in the service in Sligo Leitrim. They've come back through Demetrius with changes we need to make in that, and they've been incorporated. So just to say something about the proposed design, and I suppose what's important in all of this is to remember that we're dealing essentially with a greenfield site, so we don't have any adult services. We know that there are children who, when they reach the age of 18, will still need input, and there's no transition pathway for them now because there's no services. We know there are people currently attending the mental health services who do have ADHD but are not recognised as having it. We know that there are people in the population at the moment who are not in contact with the mental health services. Some may have had their children diagnosed, as you gave the example of the 6-year-old. Some may just hear about it. And they also need to have a service to come to, so people who are not recognised as such, but know that they have problems, and their GPs recognise them as having problems. So what we think we're going to need is 10 clinics nationally, each based on the existing mental health service areas, of which there are 10. The referrals will come from the adult teams. First of all, the new referrals and the transitions will go into the adult teams. And within the adult teams as well, there's also the group who are currently attending, who haven't been recognised as having ADHD. They will be screened. If they screen positive, they will then come to the ADHD clinics that we set up as sort of an overlying layer across the teams in specific areas. If they're diagnosed as having ADHD, they have their individual care plan, and the interventions are then provided through the ADHD clinic team. So it's very much, and we're mindful when designing this that we have to have something that is sustainable, measurable, etc. So I'll maybe just finish by the last time I was here, I said I couldn't find a good Irish role model, and I gave you Brendan Bracken, who is an Irishman who was actually the man who supported Winston Churchill. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film Darkest Hours at all, which concerns Churchill and Gary Oldman, who won the Oscar recently. And it's really interesting because if you see Churchill in action in that film, it's very obvious. They say at one stage, he's 100 ideas before breakfast. and only 3 of them are done. But the fact is he's had 100, and 3 of them are doable in an impossible situation of World War II. So, and Brendan Bracken was the man that acted as his scaffold to allow him to work. But the Irish connection actually came through Adhd Ireland. We were just Googling your site for some, well, in fact, I had read about this through another way. And when we were Googling your site, we had heard that you have that we have in Ireland, an internationally renowned designer and artist in Helen Steele. You can see the picture of Helen Steele there, who has ADHD and did, in fact, a few years ago, speak at this meeting. So, and I think that's important for us in Ireland, both in terms of having our own person who acts as a role model, encouraging people. So there you go. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you very much. Just before we get to the questions, at this stage, it's common for someone like me in my position to start bashing the HSE. But when I started this time last year, there was nothing. Thanks to Margaret, there is something. Our job now is to give her whatever support we can to get more. So, but before that, can we just, does anybody have any questions? There's just at the top there. And then hopefully we'll have a few minutes, we can open back up to bring these gentlemen in again.
Will the overheads be available as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, just sort of like a point about ADHD, and education is the key thing here. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I also live in a house with 2 SMAs, and from what I hear from them, the teachers today in primary schools aren't educated to spot the things that are developing in kids at an early stage. And the special needs assistant, which has the knowledge, can't say anything because it's not their place. You know, and I think that's one place where it should be targeted, because they're the ones who find it first.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think it is important that it's included in teacher training that there is a module on that. I understood there was, but maybe your evidence is that maybe not everyone knows about it. But it is very important, as colleagues had said, to pick up ADHD as quickly as you can. The boys get picked up, the girls don't, and they can suffer in silence, and they have huge problems with depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, etc. But we need to recognise both, and I think too that we need to recognise as well that the condition can continue, and to be able to continue to provide support for as long as people need it, and I would also say want it as well, because that's important. Thank you for making that point.
Hi, I'm up here. I can chat. Yeah, I have 2 questions. One of them is quite personal to me, so I apologize for that. But the first one is, when it comes to the price of medication in this country, is there anything being done for that? I'm on this dexamphetamine and €135 a month. I am, I have had 2 years of severe depression, and then I've come out of it. And for the fact that I don't have any money for any of these things, and that I already have a crazy amount of treatment already that is costing crazy amount. Any conversations on the price of medication being talked about?
Well, what I would say is that in general there are problems about it, and you may remember a few years ago there was an absolute outroar when one family was asked if their child with Down syndrome or their young adult with Down syndrome still had it. And following that, do you remember that? Yeah. So, ridiculous questions. And the problem is that there is this long-term drug, that there are a number of drugs that are on this long-term treatment list that which mean that people will get drugs free, and ADHD in children and young adults up to the age of 16 is one of them. So there was a group set up through one of the ministers. I think it might have been James O'Reilly, I can't remember now. And there was an initial report produced, and then there's a second group looking at it, and they were trying to move away from categories, but more looking at functional impairments to make a judgment. So it wasn't that if you have epilepsy, you get the drug, but if you have something else like ADHD when you're adult, you have to pay for the drug, or you pay above a certain amount. And just recently, actually, I contacted the person who was providing the support to that group to see had there been any outcome on that, because I'm very conscious of what you're talking about there. It doesn't seem to have reported as yet, but you're reminding me to follow up again, because it is a big problem that people do have to contribute significant amounts of money to buying their drugs up until they reach the threshold for the payback.
Is there anyone, I myself or anyone can harbour onto or contact to try and fix this as fast as possible? Because my second question will be about the fact that this is not, any of this is not happening fast enough when it comes to any treatment or anything for anyone.
No.
Is there anyone can?
I think you can, if you follow up on the group that I spoke about, there's no reason why you shouldn't follow that up in whatever way you think best, and I'm here giving you a broad hint. Because no more than yourselves, we were able to get, for developing this clinical program, making a case, we were able to get $1 million. And that'll help us set up 2 clinics. And part of the reason of collecting data is to make the case to get more money. And there is I can't produce the money, the HSE can't produce the money. There needs to be what I would say a raising of the profile of ADHD in adults, and groups like Adhd Ireland can do that very well, politically or whatever way you think fit. And I think, Ken, you were alluding to that, and that we need very much to work together, because the 1 million was hard won, put it like that, and it's only it'll service 2 parts of the country, but there will be other parts that won't have a service. So.
And my second question, I know I'm taking up a little bit of time, but I was disgustingly treated in the public health sector, and now prices are crazy and everything like that, or private and everything. But the biggest thing that I found through it, and it nearly brought me to suicide and everything, was the misinformation that is going out there, and even the fact that in every single second or third presentation I see this positive myth of ADHD and everything. Is there any fast way that we can get information out there from not just Adhd or anyone, but from the HSE straight away to psychiatrists and psychologists and everyone to stop this straight away? Because it's not just me who nearly slipped through the cracks. There's many people.
Yeah.
A pamphlet, anything. Is there any kind of, and not around the positives or anything like this, just around the severity of what's happening right now in this country?
Well, all I would say to you is that the reason that we have a clinical program is to do very much that. And as I explained to you, we have a multidisciplinary working group, so there's psychology, mental health, nursing, occupational therapy, social work. Obviously, Kate is with us. Psychiatry in terms of psychiatrists with the expertise in the form of Demetrius, general adult psychiatrists, and we have a psychiatrist managing a service as well. And we have to get that out there. So we will be doing this. At the moment, the document that I've given you a little flavour of here has been submitted to the College of Psychiatrists. They've got their clinical advisory group. They send it out to all their faculties as well. So all the psychiatrists will be getting this. So it's not for the want of trying, and this, I think, will help. The other part, too, is to make sure that we have two-pronged training in terms of, if I talk just about the psychiatrists, that those trainee psychiatrists who are going to train as adult psychiatrists, whether it's working age adults or older adults, that part of their training includes that they know how to assess ADHD in adults and how it should be treated. So that's one bit. But there's also another bit about we've got a catch-up to do, and that the psychiatrists who are working within the country now, that we would make available to them training in how you assess ADHD. And one of the attractions of the DIVA to us is that it's not just that it's free, but rather more that there is there's very good training available. I myself and a number of colleagues have gone and done the DIVA training course provided by UCAN, which is the United Kingdom's training course. They will also come over here and train on site. We hope we'll have a training budget that would allow us to do that as well. And there's also a training for the medications, and that again is provided by them. So we can develop our own training, but for the first bit, we may have to import the training to get it done. We need to do it for the other disciplines as well, and certainly for the medication. The nurses are quite important in running the ADHD clinics, but also in the interventions, the psychological interventions, the psychoeducation that the education that you talked about. All of that does need training. It's all available there, but it's a bit about having a plan for how it can be done, because unless we've got a document, and a document that's accepted, and this is what the clinical program hopefully will do, that we can bring this to people and say, this is the evidence, this is what happens, this is how we can do this, and make sure that we have a uniform response around the country. So it doesn't matter whether you live in Donegal or Kerry, or whether you're living in Clondalkin, that you'll get the same level of service. You'll meet skilled people who understand ADHD, know how to assess for it, and the treatments are available. And I think if you have a clear plan, you can do that. If you're just talking and saying it has to be done, you get nowhere. You have to have a plan and prove it can be implemented. And the two first sites are really key, because if we can get sites that are enthusiastic about doing that, those sort of, they call them early converters, can encourage other areas as well. And I can see a colleague of mine actually in the audience at the moment, and I'm hoping the reason is because he's interested. So he's nodded to me, so hopefully. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just want just some, because...
Sorry, Jack, just we really have to...
Yeah.
There's a lady over here asking a question.
Just the timeline.
Sorry, Jack.
While we're waiting for these clinics to take place.
I beg your pardon, sorry.
While we're waiting for these clinics to open and be
Yeah.
in place, at the moment, if an adult wants to get assessed,
Yeah.
what do they do? Go to a GP and get referred? Is it through the HSE?
Well, you can do that. There are no waiting lists. I mean, I'm very committed to this because it is a huge gap. At the moment, there is no formal mechanism in place in the public services for people to be assessed, and that's why it is really important that we get this clinical program across the line, and also why I'm so interested in working with Adhd Ireland and yourselves in making sure that there is a public acknowledgement of ADHD in adults, that it is made known in whatever way you think fit that this is a problem. We need to develop the services, and we need to do it as fast as we can, allowing for training, recruitment, and all the rest of it.
So the only way is to go privately at the moment?
Well, I would say that it can be useful to actually go to your GP, for people to go, and we're saying that to people. If you know that if sometimes we get questions in, and we would say, go to the GP, say you think you've got ADHD, go through the referral, because even if they're saying, well, actually we can't do too much for you now, it's at least highlighting the problem at service level. And when we've given people information about, in the meantime, in the services, about the fact that there is training for assessment available through for the DIVA and the interventions that might help. But we do need to have a very focused approach. So even highlighting the fact to the GP and onto the mental health services will be helpful to us.
Sorry, just the next question. Just the lady up in the top corner, Heather.
Digital waiting list for 33 months. It should be 14 by the time. That's it. Hasn't been pushed back.
What age are you talking about?
I'm just saying my youngest daughter
Is 14.
She's 11, but
Well, she should be getting a service now through the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. Well, I'm only saying she should, and you can follow up on, with the local, contact the local service about it, including the management of the local service. Because just to be clear, children should be getting a service up to their 18th birthday. So if you've a problem, follow it up locally.
So we're just going to take a couple more questions, and maybe I'll ask Tony and Oliver if they'd like to maybe sum up for a moment. So just the lady up in the top corner.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a really important point, and I'm sorry I didn't emphasise it more, but we do have a GP representative on our working group, again, David Hanlon, who you might know, the National Clinical Advisor, and he's also working as a GP in Lucan area, so he's the au fait with it, and we'd hope to do exactly what you're talking about in terms of the Irish College. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Be very happy to do that. I might talk to you afterwards then.
Just that the reason these two guys in town, something called the COCO project, which is an EU-funded project on comorbidities. I would have been talking to the chair today specifically around the issues of doctor training. So we're talking about the possibility of bringing over some other couple of experts, maybe after Christmas, to provide that training and information to doctors. So hopefully we'll be able to provide that very quickly to you.
And no disrespect to these guys here, but brilliant at what they do, and we lost wages. But I've also found in the groups, the people that have the issues are good at having the groups as well. And they should be trained as well. No disrespect to yourself, but the experience is that the wealth of their experience put across.
We have occasions with us. She has ADHD and has done extremely well, and has done research on ADHD as well in terms of getting feedback from people with it, and that's been very helpful in framing how we design the service as well. So it's a good point.
Okay. Does Oliver tell you have any jump in there? Or have a chat about what I'm talking about? Give us an international perspective.
I think it's absolutely important to have the knowledge and the point of view of the patients inside of our research. We are doing research, and we only aim to improve the knowledge and improve the management and the treatment of this condition. I absolutely agree with you can on the more first sentence of what Ken today was ADHD is a real condition and it's severe. It's a spectrum, yes, it's a relation, mild or severe people. But mild and severe people can have good treatment, and that is the best point of the best idea of today. We have good instruments to assess with high quality ADHD management also. And also we have good treatment, drug treatment, psychological treatment, and we hope that in the next future we have probiotics to see and to decrease the depression rate with light therapy or physical exercise, anything. That is the good point. We are movement, doing research, and doing research for people like you. And to me was funny today. I observed all of you. You have the same problems, the same questions like people in Catalonia, people in Spain, people in Germany, Japan, around the world. And I think it's absolutely essential to have a strong
One more last question. That lady up there, go.
Is there a timetable for opening up the clinics?
Well, as I was saying to you, we have the funding to start 2 of the clinics. So we'll be looking, we've got to identify the 2 sites to start off with. So we've done some preliminary work on that. And then there'll be a period of readiness, which will include recruiting. You've heard about the difficulties we have recruiting, but we hope to overcome that. So recruitment will be one thing, and then there'll be training of the people who take on board. Because obviously, as I said, we're likely to get people fully trained in assessment and treatment, but we're likely to have to ensure that that's provided for them. We see that as the lesser problem, but the bigger problem really would be recruiting. We hope to set up.
Are you talking this year?
We're talking, I would say optimistically, we start this year as soon as we can, with a view to having them up and running next year. And hopefully, fingers crossed, all goes well. Thank you.
How do patients access the clinic? Would that be through the GP?
Yes, full GP referral, yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to.
Obviously,
Sorry.
it's a child, it will be child and adolescent services, and we have a protocol for how that will happen in terms of having to have an up-to-date assessment 6 months before the 18th birthday, and also that there will be a decommission plans team, which are adolescent teams that will be responsible for ensuring transitions.
Thank you. We go for a last question from the person in blue.
Yeah, will private diagnosis be accepted by the new system, or will people have to get retested?
Well, it depends really. I mean, one of the, I met another psychiatrist who said, well, I have to be honest and say, what we don't want is that people are getting private psychiatry assessments and they're fast tracking those who can't afford private assessments. So they're getting intervention. So I think we have to be very clear about that. What the private, I know my colleague who I referred to as chairing of the group provides the interventions as part and parcel of the whole treatment package, and that has to be done as well. So we want to make sure there's fairness, that we can't fast track just because
Is that not putting the resources, the limited resources we have under even further strain?
and then you're not.
Is that not putting the limited resources we have under further strain and actually slowing down any treatment?
Well, not really. I think we have to ensure equity of access, and that's one of the things that we're really very keen on. There will be equity of
But
access.
if no formal system exists, there isn't equity of access. If no formal system exists
I'm
now, there
talking
isn't
about,
equity
say,
of access.
no, if we're setting up the clinics in the 2 sites, then the people will go through the assessment process, and then they'll put the intervention, so they're obviously not to decide whether they want to take them. But what we won't feel favour of is people getting private assessments in those 2 areas and then trying to fast track into the interventions. Because that is the key.
What locations are you looking at for the sites? What locations?
Well, as I was saying, I'm giving away nothing at the moment because we're working. We're working. We want to make sure that the 2 sites that come forward are ones that are really interested in doing this. Because it's only if you get people who are interested, and I'm talking about professionals who are interested in working with us on this, that we want to have the best possible chance of success in those 2 sites and encourage other parts of the country. And also, we need to be able to show our paymasters, government, etc., that there is a need, so we have data, we prove there's a need. So if there's a need here in county, wherever it is, the need is just the same as somewhere else. So, we're not fighting for this.
Just directives from the EU for work in other countries. Is there any other countries that have developed similar things that are going on at the moment?
In terms of services?
Yeah.
Oh yes, some countries are much further ahead. Germany, I think, I heard from Germany talk
Okay.
They would be EU access, EU directive, content and the private service.
So just before we close, would Oliver, Tony likes it because you've travelled all the way from Barcelona to Frankfurt, so only manually to offer you the last word. You don't have to? No? Okay. Oh, you do want it? Okay.
It was a fantastic. The patient perspective for me, because I think the problems patients have are more or less the same, independent in which country you live in. And a lot of problems you talked about are the same for patients in Germany in more rural areas. As I work in Frankfurt, the possibility for mental health care are quite luxurious in comparison to other parts of Germany, and I think the same problem is here. So what you can do as patients is raise your voice, and that's your very politician.
Okay, well, just to wrap up and take 30 seconds to do so. Firstly, I'd like to thank our representatives Margot, Tony and Oliver. They've travelled far distance tonight. But possibly more importantly, I'd like to thank you, because I know that there's faces, and I'm looking around there, I know I see people come from Belfast, Enniskillen, Thurles, Donegal. So people come from all around the country, which just sheer evidence of the need to get more information and support for people with ADHD. So anything out there that can do to help that, we're here to help. Margot here is here to help. So again, all I want to say is thank you very much for coming, and we appreciate your support. Thank you very much. Good night.